My name is Jessa Chabot, and I work for the Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. Today, I will be introducing the second session, Unconventional Oil and Gas, Community Impacts, and Environmental Justice. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lara Cushing, the framing panelist for this session. Dr. Cushing holds a BS in Molecular Environmental Biology, an MPH in Epidemiology, and a PhD in Energy and Resources Group from the University of California, Berkeley. She is currently Assistant Professor of Environmental Health Sciences and Fielding Presidential Chair in Health Equity at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Her work has investigated questions of environmental justice in the context of hazardous industrial facilities, prenatal exposures to harmful man-made chemicals, urban green space, oil and gas drilling, and global climate change. Welcome, Dr. Cushing.
Thank you, Jessa. It's a pleasure to be here. I was asked to give brief framing remarks, and I thought I would start with presenting some of the principles of environmental justice as adopted at the First National People of Colors Summit in Environmental Leadership in 1991. So this is going way back. I'm not showing all of the principles, but some that I thought particularly germane to today's discussion are around the political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of communities. And this is really getting to the right of all people to live in a clean environment. The rights of participation and of communities, impacted communities, to participate as equal partners at every level of environmental decision-making. And I think both of these can be undermined in the oil and gas context, in particular, where decisions about well pad development are often in the hands of individual property owners. Different entities may own land and subsurface mineral rights, such that it becomes very difficult for communities to have and exercise self-determination about if and where drilling takes place. Also wanted to highlight, the articulation of the right of all workers to a safe and healthy work environment and not having to choose between unemployment and a safe livelihood, which I think is very relevant to our context, particularly in rural communities where oil and gas development is a pillar of local economies and a key job provider for some. And finally, the special legal and natural relationship of Native peoples to the US government, including treaty rights. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sharing my slides, am I? Let me share my slides. Okay, so the last kind of principle of environmental justice that I thought could help frame our discussion today was around the special legal relationship of Native peoples to the US government, and including treaty rights and sovereign status that holds particular relevance, I think, to the discussion of environmental justice in relation to unconventional oil and gas development, given Native-led struggles against the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, and the community impacts of oil development on Native lands in places like the Bakken Shale. The environmental justice movement has articulated several different dimensions of justice, three of which I wanted to highlight for our discussion. The first is really around distributional justice. So this is the idea that socially disadvantaged groups, particularly low-income communities of color, should not be disproportionately burdened by environmental hazards and toxic pollutants. And distributional justice really requires us to ask questions about who is most impacted and how environmental risks are shared and whether they're shared equally across dimensions of race and class. Second, the idea of procedural justice, so that communities who are on the front line of polluting industries really need to be included and represented in decision-making processes. So this requires us to ask questions like who's at the decision-making table, whose voice is being heard and valued. And finally, I think particularly salient in this moment we're in of political transition right now at the federal level from an administration that was very supportive of deregulating the fossil fuel industry to one that has embraced the idea that we need to, at least to some extent, decarbonize our economy, is this idea of just transition. So that workers and communities in fossil fuel industries are compensated for job losses and supported as we transition from a carbon-based fossil fuel to a renewable energy economy. Historically, the movement for environmental justice, I think it's also important to remember, has always centered racism in their analysis and the disproportionate burden of hazardous industries in communities of color. So given that our discussion today, I think, is going to center somewhat on policy, I thought it would be useful here at the beginning to define racist policy and offer this definition from Ibram X. Kendi, which is that racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. What is so powerful about this definition is, I think, the focus on the impact of policy rather than the intent of the policy or of policymakers. And, you know, this definition may strike some as pretty radical, or, you know, a lot of policies would fall into this category. But I think it's informative in the environmental justice context where, for example, the courts have proven largely ineffective in remedying environmental injustices because of the hurdle of having to demonstrate discriminatory intent. The result being that it becomes very hard to hold governments or corporations accountable for persistent racial disparities in environmental exposures. A good historical example of this in the oil and gas context that has been written about by Daniel G. Cummings in his work on Black Gold and White Power is the role of federal redlining maps in the 1930s that were, you know, ostensibly about increasing access to home loans and home ownership. But because they were racially restrictive covenants went into the demarcation of which neighborhoods were considered creditworthy. In practice, redlining resulted in restricting many African American and Latino families to the petro-industrial neighborhoods of Los Angeles, shown here. And today, about 1 in 3 people in LA County lives within a mile of an oil well, and the majority of those people are people of color. And lastly, I wanted to comment on what Caitlin Kelly-Reif and Steve Wing have highlighted as an underappreciated dimension of environmental justice, and that is this idea of an urban-rural divide. This photo here is of the 1982 protests over in Warren County, rural Warren County, North Carolina, over the dumping of PCB-laden soils. And these protests were, you know, are credited with bringing issues of environmental justice to the national stage and garnering a lot of national attention. So really, since the beginning, the modern environmental justice movement has highlighted how rural communities are singled out for locally unwanted industries and treated as, you know, a dumping ground for waste. At the same time, many rural communities face additional challenges to health, higher rates of poverty, limited access to healthcare that contribute to an urban-rural gap in life expectancy that's currently growing and is more severe for people of color. So in the context we're speaking about today, I think it's important to, you know, consider that resources like oil and gas are mostly extracted from rural areas, but for the primary benefit of urban populations. And this dynamic, you know, ultimately undermines progress towards more sustainable systems of energy provision, because with a few exceptions, like the LA example I gave previously, the urban majority do not really experience the environmental and health consequences of oil and gas production. And so there's less incentive for supporting, policies to reduce those impacts. So with those framing remarks, I also wanted to share very briefly just some findings from our own work on the environmental justice implications of flaring from unconventional oil and gas. So if you were part of the previous session, you heard earlier from Dr. Jill Johnston about our work to use satellite observation to identify where flaring is happening in the Eagle Ford Shale of South Texas. For those of you who maybe weren't part of that, just briefly, flaring is the intentional combustion of waste gases that flares can operate for days or even months at a time during drilling and production in places where there's not the infrastructure to capture and use the gas on site or to transport it and sell it. And there was a question about, have you looked at the environmental justice dimensions of this? So when we connected those measurements of flaring to census data on community demographics, we found that communities, here defined as census blocks, where more than 80% of residents identified as Hispanic or Latinx, those communities had roughly twice as much flaring occurring within 5 kilometers as communities where the residents were over 80% white. And this was somewhat surprising to us because we saw, as Dr. Johnston mentioned, the opposite pattern in terms of where permitted well locations were located. So this, disproportionate exposure was independent of where wells are being sited. And in subsequent work where we linked the flaring data to administrative birth records, we were able to estimate a pretty significant increase in preterm birth rates among women exposed to 10 or more flare events within 5 kilometers of their home during their pregnancies. And when we looked at Hispanic or Latina women alone and separately from white women, it was really amongst the Hispanic women where we saw the association. That's what's shown in this graph here with the circled point estimate there, which is an odds ratio. And Eagle Ford is not the only place where flaring is common. I think we already saw from the previous presentation some of the other places where it's happening. So I would argue that from an environmental justice perspective, it's an understudied dimension of unconventional oil and gas development, and one that is occurring, in low-income rural regions of the country that have Texas, New Mexico, North Dakota, that have also received less attention from scholars and policymakers in terms of the community impacts. So in summary, and I wanted to thank the organizers of this panel and the conference, which I forgot to do at the beginning, for inviting me and for putting together such an excellent program. But in summary, I think in order to consider environmental justice as we do our work around unconventional oil and gas development, it's important to examine how exposures are distributed in relation to social disadvantage across race, class, across and between urban and rural areas. Also important to prioritize the authentic engagement of the communities that are impacted and living near these extraction sites, both in our research and in decision-making about how to regulate oil and gas. And finally, I would invite us to consider the consequences of policies, maybe often unintended consequences of policies to reduce exposures, to perpetuate inequalities. For example, localized bans that may result in protecting some communities, but not the surrounding communities. And so I think in the context of environmental justice, it's important to consider, how actions we may take to mitigate exposures, whether and how they they address inequalities and exposures as well as overall reductions. So I will stop there, and very much looking forward to the other presentations as well as the discussion afterwards. Thank you.